In a remote town surrounded by the snowy forests of Timber Creek, a grieving man named Jake Harrison rescues two battered dogs, Buddy and Misty, who escaped from a brutal animal trafficking operation. Their arrival sets Jake on a journey of redemption and courage as he uncovers a dark network operating in the wilderness. With the dogs by his side, Jake confronts the traffickers, risking his life to bring them to justice. Along the way, he finds renewed purpose, rekindles his connection with the community, and transforms his cabin of solitude into a home filled with love and second chances. What do you think about Jake's journey and his bond with Buddy and Misty? Are you watching from the US, Europe, or elsewhere? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to DG Story for more inspiring and emotional stories like this one. Your support helps us create even more exciting tales. The wind howled relentlessly, sweeping through the icy trees of Timber Creek. Snow covered every visible surface, turning the small mountain town into a frozen, desolate landscape. Jake Harrison sat in his dimly lit cabin, a single log crackling weakly in the fireplace. He stared blankly at the fading photograph on the wooden mantel, his wife and daughter, smiling brightly under a summer sun long gone. For years, Jake had lived in solitude, his heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. A former firefighter, he had once been a man of action, of purpose, but the tragic loss of his family in a fire he couldn't prevent had stripped him of everything. Now, his days were spent in silence, interrupted only by the occasional delivery of supplies from the nearest town. Outside, the storm raged on. Amid the blizzard's chaos, two figures emerged, barely visible against the white backdrop. A large dog, his golden coat marred by dirt and ice, trudged through the deep snow, its paws bleeding from countless miles of relentless wandering. Behind it, a smaller dog stumbled, its frail body barely able to keep up. The larger dog, Buddy, paused, turning back to nudge the smaller one forward. Misty whimpered softly, her legs shaking as she tried to move. Her light coat was patchy, her ribs visible through her thin frame. Buddy glanced around, his deep brown eyes scanning the area for shelter. In the distance, he caught sight of the faint glow of Jake's cabin. With newfound determination, Buddy pushed forward, leading Misty toward the light. Jake was startled by a soft scratching sound at his door. First, he thought it was the wind, but the sound came again, deliberate and persistent. Frowning, he grabbed the flashlight from the table and approached the door cautiously. Living in isolation had taught him to be wary of unexpected visitors. When he opened the door, the freezing wind blasted into the cabin, carrying with it the scent of snow and frost. The beam of his flashlight illuminated two dogs on his porch, one standing unsteadily, his body trembling, and the other collapsed beside it, barely moving. Jake's heart clenched at the sight. The larger dog looked up at him, its eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and silent pleading. Without thinking, Jake swung the door open wider. "Come on," he muttered, stepping aside. Buddy hesitated for a moment before nudging Misty gently. The smaller dog whimpered but managed to take a shaky step forward. Jake knelt down, scooping Misty into his arms despite the cold seeping through his shirt. He felt the frailty of her body, the sharp edges of her ribs. Inside the cabin, Jake set Misty down near the fire, covering her with an old blanket. Buddy followed, collapsing onto the floor with a heavy sigh. Jake grabbed a bowl, filled it with warm water, and placed it near the dogs. "Drink," he said softly, his voice gruff but kind. Buddy lapped at the water gratefully, but Misty was too weak to move. Jake dipped a cloth into the bowl and gently wiped the frost and dirt from her fur. As he worked, he noticed the scars on Buddy's shoulders and the raw wounds on both their paws. "What happened to you too?" he murmured, his tone tinged with a mix of curiosity and anger. The dogs didn't answer, of course, but their battered forms spoke volumes. Jake sat back, watching as Buddy lay protectively beside Misty, his body curling around hers to keep her warm. For the first time in years, Jake felt something stir within him, a flicker of purpose. Faint but undeniable. The storm raged on through the night, but inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire created a fragile sanctuary. Jake sat at the kitchen table, his eyes flicking between the two dogs resting near the hearth. Buddy lay curled around Misty, his body acting as a shield against the remnants of the cold. Misty's breathing was shallow but steady, her small frame rising and falling under the thick blanket Jake had draped over her. Jake leaned back in his chair, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his coffee mug. He couldn't stop staring at the scars that crisscrossed Buddy's coat or the raw, bloody pads on his paws. These weren't ordinary strays. These dogs had been through something cruel. As dawn broke, Jake rose from his chair and knelt beside the dogs. Misty stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open to reveal soft, amber irises. Jake smiled faintly. "Hey there," he said gently. "You're safe now." Buddy lifted his head at the sound of Jake's voice, his dark eyes meeting the man's with a look of cautious trust. Jake reached out a hand slowly, giving Buddy a chance to sniff before gently scratching behind his ears. "You're a tough one," Jake murmured. "Taking care of her like that." He stood and moved to the kitchen, opening the fridge to retrieve a carton of eggs. Within minutes, the aroma of scrambled eggs filled the cabin. Jake set a small plate on the floor near the fire, watching as Buddy sniffed it cautiously before eating. Misty didn't move, her energy still too depleted. Jake sat back down, his mind racing with questions. Where had these dogs come from? Who had hurt them? And why had they chosen his cabin of all places? As the hours passed, the storm began to subside. The wind died down, and sunlight filtered weakly through the frost-covered windows. Jake decided it was time to check on Misty more thoroughly. He approached her slowly, crouching down to inspect her injuries. "Let's see what we're dealing with," he said quietly. Misty whimpered softly as Jake lifted her paw, examining the raw wounds. He fetched a first aid kit from the bathroom and began cleaning her cuts with warm water and antiseptic. Buddy watched every move, his gaze sharp and protective. "You don't trust me yet, do you?" Jake said, glancing at Buddy. "I get it, but I'm not gonna hurt her. Or you." Buddy didn't move, but his tail gave a single wag, as if acknowledging the man's words. After tending to Misty, Jake grabbed his coat and boots. He needed to get to town for supplies, food for the dogs, medical ointments, and maybe some answers. Before leaving, he knelt beside Buddy. "Stay here," he said firmly. "Keep her safe. I'll be back soon." Buddy tilted his head but didn't move, his loyalty to Misty apparent. Jake stepped out into the fresh snow, the cold biting at his face as he made his way to his old truck parked near the cabin. The small town of Timber Creek was just waking up when Jake arrived. He parked outside the local feed store, the bell above the door jingling as he entered. "Morning, Jake," the store owner, Martha, greeted. She was a kind woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes and a warm smile. "Haven't seen you in a while." "Yeah," Jake replied gruffly, grabbing a bag of dog food. "Needed supplies. Didn't know you had a dog," Martha said, raising an eyebrow. "Two, actually," Jake muttered. Martha's curiosity was piqued. "Two? Strays? Found them outside my cabin last night. They're in bad shape. Real bad." Martha's expression darkened. "You hear about the animal trafficking rumors?" Jake frowned. "Animal trafficking?" "Yeah, been going on for months," Martha said, lowering her voice. "Dogs, cats, even exotic animals. Some folks think they're using the forest as a cover. Poor things get treated like trash." Jake's jaw tightened. The scars on Buddy's body and the frailty of Misty suddenly made sense. "You think these two?" Martha nodded grimly. "Could be. You should report it." Jake hesitated. The idea of getting involved in something so dark was daunting. But as he thought about Buddy's unwavering loyalty and Misty's fragile condition, a sense of duty began to stir within him. "Thanks, Martha," he said, paying for the supplies and heading back to his truck. Back at the cabin, Buddy greeted Jake with a soft bark, his tail wagging faintly. Misty was still curled up by the fire, but her ears twitched at the sound of Jake's voice. Jake placed the supplies on the table and crouched beside the dogs. "Looks like we've got some trouble to figure out," he said, his voice low but steady. Buddy met his gaze, as if understanding every word. The snow glistened under the weak morning sun as Jake shoveled a narrow path outside his cabin. His mind churned with the information Martha had shared: animal trafficking in Timber Creek. The idea left a bitter taste in his mouth, but the scars on Buddy and Misty were undeniable evidence of cruelty. Inside, the cabin was warm, but the tension was palpable. Buddy lay near the door, his ears perked at every creak and gust of wind. Misty had managed to eat a small meal and seemed a little stronger, though she remained curled near the fire. Jake set down the shovel and stepped inside, brushing snow off his coat. "All right," he muttered to himself. "If there's trouble in these woods, we're going to find out." Buddy lifted his head as Jake pulled a map from a drawer, spreading it across the table. The forest surrounding Timber Creek was vast and thick, with dozens of trails crisscrossing through the pines. Jake's finger hovered over a marked section of the map, the old lumber mill, abandoned for years. "That's where I'd start," he said aloud, glancing at Buddy. "If I were hiding something, it'd be there." Buddy tilted his head, his gaze sharp and watchful. By midday, Jake had gathered supplies for a trip into the woods: a flashlight, rope, a knife, and his old hiking boots. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, but he couldn't ignore the growing need to uncover the truth. He knelt beside Misty, who blinked up at him with amber eyes. "You stay here," he said softly, stroking her head. "Buddy and I will check things out." Misty whimpered, nuzzling his hand. Buddy, as if understanding the plan, stood and padded to Jake's side, his posture alert. "Let's go." "Then," Jake said, grabbing his coat and stepping outside. The forest was eerily quiet, the thick snow muffling every sound. Jake moved carefully, his boots crunching softly with each step. Buddy stayed close, his nose occasionally dipping to the ground to catch a scent. As they approached the area near the old lumber mill, Jake's instincts flared. The stillness was unnatural, almost oppressive. He paused, scanning the trees for any signs of movement. Then he saw it, a faint trail of tracks leading deeper into the woods. They weren't animal tracks, these were boot prints, partially obscured by fresh snow. Jake crouched, examining the prints closely. "Someone's been here recently," he muttered, glancing at Buddy. The dog let out a low growl, his body tensing. Jake straightened, following the tracks cautiously. They led to a clearing where the rusted remains of the lumber mill loomed like a skeleton against the pale sky. Jake's breath fogged in the cold air as he approached the building. The structure was crumbling, with broken windows and sagging beams. But there were signs of recent activity: tire tracks in the snow, a pile of discarded food wrappers near the entrance. "This is it," Jake whispered, his pulse quickening. Buddy growled again, his ears flattening against his head. Jake held up a hand to calm him before stepping inside the mill. The interior was dark and frigid, the air heavy with the scent of decay. Jake's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing rows of rusted machinery and broken pallets. Then he saw them: cages. They were lined against the far wall, some empty, others containing filthy blankets and scraps of food. Jake's stomach turned as he approached, the beam of his flashlight catching faint claw marks on the metal bars. "Damn it," he muttered, his voice trembling with anger. Buddy sniffed at one of the cages, his tail stiff and his growl low. Jake knelt beside him, his eyes narrowing as he noticed something tucked beneath the cage. A notebook. He reached for it, brushing away the dust and grime. The notebook was filled with detailed entries, dates, descriptions of animals, and prices. Jake flipped through the pages, his hands shaking as the scale of the operation became clear. "This is sick," he said through gritted teeth. Suddenly, the sound of voices echoed through the mill. Jake froze, his heart pounding. He quickly stuffed the notebook into his coat and motioned for Buddy to stay quiet. "Check the cages," a gruff voice said. "Make sure nothing's been disturbed." Jake ducked behind a rusted machine, gripping Buddy's collar to keep him still. Two men entered the mill, both wearing heavy coats and carrying flashlights. "I told you we should have moved this stuff after the last storm," one of them said, his voice laced with frustration. "Relax," the other replied. "Nobody comes out here in this weather." Jake held his breath, his mind racing. He had to get out without being seen. Buddy growled softly, his instincts sharp. Jake placed a calming hand on the dog's head, whispering, "Not yet." As the men moved toward the cages, Jake saw his chance. He slipped through a side door, Buddy close on his heels. The cold air hit him like a wall, but he didn't stop, darting into the cover of the trees. The men's voices faded behind him, but Jake knew they wouldn't stay oblivious for long. Clutching the notebook tightly, he quickened his pace, Buddy guiding him back toward the safety of the cabin. When they finally reached the cabin, Jake collapsed into a chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He set the notebook on the table, his hands trembling with a mix of anger and adrenaline. Buddy sat beside him, his watchful eyes scanning the room. Misty stirred from her spot near the fire, her ears perking up as Jake approached her. "We found something," Jake said softly, his voice filled with resolve. "And we're not letting this go." The cabin felt heavier that night, as if the knowledge Jake had uncovered in the mill carried its own oppressive weight. The notebook lay open on the table, its pages filled with damning evidence, descriptions of animals, locations, transaction dates, and prices. Every line was a reminder of the cruelty lurking in the shadows of Timber Creek. Jake leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. Buddy lay at his feet, his ears twitching at every creak and groan of the old cabin. Misty, now stronger, had wandered to the edge of the room, her nose pressed curiously against the door. "This is bigger than I thought," Jake muttered, his gaze fixed on the notebook. He reached for his old cell phone. The screen cracked from years of neglect, and dialed the sheriff's office. "Sheriff Bradley speaking," a gruff voice answered. "Brad, it's Jake Harrison." There was a pause on the line. "Jake? Been a long time. What's going on?" Jake hesitated, his eyes flicking to the notebook. "I've got something you need to see. Evidence of animal trafficking up here in the forest." The sheriff's tone grew serious. "Animal trafficking? You sure about this?" "Positive. I found a notebook at the old mill. It's detailed, real detailed. Cages, dates, the whole operation." There was another pause, longer this time. "That's a serious claim. Jake, you sure you want to get involved in something like this?" Jake's grip on the phone tightened. "I don't have a choice. These bastards need to be stopped." "All right," the sheriff said. "Bring it to the station tomorrow morning. We'll take a look." Jake hung up, his jaw set, but even as he felt a small measure of relief, a nagging sense of unease settled in his chest. He glanced at Buddy and Misty, who were both staring at him as if sensing his thoughts. "We're not out of this yet," Jake murmured. That night, Jake barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside made his heart race. Buddy, ever watchful, lay near the door, his body tense and ready. Misty stayed close to Jake, curling up at his side as if seeking comfort. Just past midnight, the uneasy silence was shattered by the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside. Jake shot up, his heart pounding. Buddy growled low, his body coiled like a spring. Jake grabbed the flashlight and his hunting knife. Moving silently to the window, he peeked through the frost-covered glass and froze. 3 figures stood at the edge of the clearing, their faces obscured by hoods. One of them carried a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. Another held something heavier, possibly a crowbar. Jake's pulse quickened. He backed away from the window, motioning for Buddy to stay quiet. Misty let out a soft whimper, but Jake placed a calming hand on her head. The men moved closer, their voices muffled but growing louder. Jake strained to hear. "I told you they'd come back here," one of them said. "Boss wants that notebook." Another replied, "No witnesses." Jake's blood ran cold. He had to act fast. "All right," he whispered to Buddy, kneeling down to meet the dog's steady gaze. "We've got company. You up for this?" Buddy let out a soft bark, his tail wagging once before his body stiffened. Ready for action. Jake grabbed the notebook from the table and stuffed it into his coat. He turned to Misty, scooping her up despite her soft protests, and carried her to the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. "You stay here," he said firmly, closing the door behind her. The sound of boots crunching closer snapped Jake back to the moment. He moved to the front door, gripping the knife tightly. Buddy positioned himself beside Jake, his growl growing louder. A loud bang reverberated through the cabin as one of the men slammed something against the door. "Open up," a voice barked. "We know you're in there." Jake didn't respond. Instead, he motioned for Buddy to stay low and moved silently to the window. He lifted the curtain just enough to see one of the men trying to force the door open while another circled the cabin. Jake's mind raced. If they got inside, there'd be no way to protect the dogs and himself. Buddy suddenly let out a ferocious bark, startling the men outside. Jake seized the moment of distraction, throwing the door open and lunging at the man nearest him. The scuffle was quick but brutal. Jake shoved the man back into the snow, his knife glinting in the moonlight. Buddy charged at another attacker, his teeth bared and his growls echoing through the clearing. The third man, clearly rattled, took a step back. "You don't know who you're messing with," he shouted. "Neither do you," Jake shot back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Buddy's ferocity sent the men retreating into the woods, their shouts fading into the night. Jake stood in the doorway, his chest heaving as he watched them disappear. He turned to Buddy, who was panting heavily but uninjured. "Good boy," Jake said, his voice filled with gratitude. Inside the cabin, Misty let out a soft bark from the bedroom. Jake opened the door, scooping her up and holding her close. "We're not safe here anymore," he said, his voice low, "but we've got what we need to end this." As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Jake packed a small bag, his mind set on what came next. The first rays of dawn filtered through the snow-covered pines as Jake tightened the straps on his pack. His cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a target painted in bright red. The notebook, tucked securely in his jacket, felt heavier than it should. It wasn't just evidence, it was a declaration of war. Buddy paced near the doorway, his sharp eyes scanning the forest. Misty stayed close to Jake's feet, her small body trembling, not from the cold but from the unease that hung in the air. Jake knelt beside Buddy, placing a hand on the dog's head. "This is gonna be dangerous, boy," he murmured. "But I need you with me." Buddy let out a soft bark, his tail wagging faintly, as if to say, "I'm ready." Jake glanced at Misty, her amber eyes filled with a trust that made his chest tighten. "You're coming too," he said softly, "but we'll keep you safe." By mid-morning, Jake had left the cabin behind, making his way through the dense forest. His destination was clear, the sheriff's office in town, where he would hand over the notebook and alert the authorities. But the path was treacherous, both in terrain and in risk. He knew Ethan Ward's men wouldn't give up so easily. The snow crunched under Jake's boots as he trudged through the woods, his breath visible in the frigid air. Buddy stayed ahead, his nose to the ground, while Misty followed closely, her small frame weaving through the underbrush. Jake's grip tightened on the shotgun slung over his shoulder. He wasn't one to carry weapons, but after the events of the previous night, he wasn't taking any chances. Hours passed, the forest growing quieter with each step. Jake's instincts prickled. Something wasn't right. He motioned for Buddy to stop, crouching low to the ground. Ahead, faint voices carried through the trees. Jake's jaw clenched as he signaled for the dogs to stay put. He crept forward, using the thick pines as cover. In a small clearing, 3 men stood around a snow-covered trail, their breath visible as they spoke in hushed tones. One of them carried a rifle slung over his back, while another held a radio, the static breaking through the stillness. "They've got to be heading this way," one of the men said, his voice sharp with frustration. "Boss wants that notebook." Another replied, "He's got buyers lined up, and if we lose it..." The first man cut him off. "We're not losing it. Keep your eyes open." Jake retreated quietly, his mind racing. They were blocking the main trail to town, likely searching for him and the dogs. He couldn't risk a direct confrontation, not yet. Returning to Buddy and Misty, Jake knelt down and whispered, "We're taking the long way." Jake led the dogs off the main trail, forging a path through the dense underbrush. The snow was deeper here, slowing their progress, but it also provided cover. Buddy stayed alert, his ears swiveling at every sound. Misty, though smaller and less sturdy, kept pace, her determination unwavering. As the sun began to set, Jake spotted an abandoned hunting cabin nestled between the trees. It was little more than a wooden shell, but it would serve as a temporary refuge. The interior was cold and musty, but it offered shelter from the biting wind. Jake set down his pack, shaking snow from his coat. Buddy and Misty curled up near the corner, their bodies pressed together for warmth. Jake sat at the small, rickety table, pulling the notebook from his jacket, flipping through its pages. He couldn't shake the anger boiling in his chest. Each entry was a story of suffering, animals treated as commodities, their lives reduced to numbers and dollar signs. He clenched his fists, his thoughts drifting to Ethan Ward. The man wasn't just a criminal, he was a predator, preying on the helpless for profit. "You're going down," Jake muttered under his breath. That night, the forest was eerily quiet. Jake lay awake, his senses heightened as he listened for any sign of danger. Buddy dozed lightly at his side, his ears twitching at the faintest noise. Misty was curled against Jake's chest, her small body a comforting weight. Sometime past midnight, Buddy suddenly lifted his head, his body tensing. A low growl rumbled from his throat. Jake bolted upright, his hand instinctively reaching for his shotgun. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Buddy's gaze was fixed on the door, his growl growing louder. Jake's stomach tightened as he heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps outside. He moved silently, positioning himself near the window, peering through the cracked glass. He spotted shadows moving among the trees. "They found us," Jake muttered, his grip tightening on the shotgun. The first knock on the door was sharp and deliberate. A voice called out, "We know you're in there. Harrison, hand over the notebook. And no one gets hurt." Jake glanced at Buddy, who was now standing, his body coiled like a spring. Misty whimpered softly, pressing closer to Jake. "You've got 10 seconds, the voice shouted. Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to lose the notebook, but he couldn't let the dogs get hurt either. "All right," he called back, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "I'll come out." Buddy let out a low growl, but Jake held up a hand. "Trust me," he whispered, opening the door slowly. Jake stepped into the freezing night. The men stood in a semicircle, their faces obscured by scarves and hoods. "Smart choice," one of them said, stepping forward. "Now hand it over." Jake's eyes flicked to Buddy, who remained hidden inside the cabin. He could feel the dog's presence, waiting for his signal. "I'll give it to you," Jake said, his voice calm. "But I've got a question first." The man frowned. "You're in no position to negotiate." Jake smirked, his grip tightening on the shotgun. "You sure about that?" Before the man could respond, Buddy lunged from the shadows, his growl ripping through the night. Chaos erupted as Jake raised his shotgun, the fight for survival kicking into high gear. Chaos erupted in the snowy clearing. Buddy's growl cut through the cold night air as he lunged at one of the men, his powerful jaws snapping with precision. The man staggered backward, shouting in shock as he tried to fend off the dog. Jake didn't hesitate, raising the shotgun. He aimed at the feet of the nearest man and fired. The blast sprayed snow into the air, forcing the group to scatter. "Stay back," Jake barked, his voice filled with the authority he hadn't used in years. The men hesitated, their confidence shaken by the ferocity of Buddy and Jake's unwavering stance. One of them cursed under his breath, pulling a knife from his belt. "You're making a mistake, Harrison," the leader growled. Jake stepped forward, his eyes locked on the man. "The only mistake was thinking you could walk into my life and threaten me." Before the man could respond, Buddy lunged again, this time knocking the knife from his hand. The weapon landed in the snow with a soft thud, and the man stumbled, falling onto his back. From inside the cabin, Misty barked, her high-pitched yips adding to the confusion. Jake spared a glance over his shoulder, relieved to see her still safely tucked inside. The remaining two men regrouped, their breath visible in the frigid air. One of them pulled a pistol from his coat, leveling it at Jake. "Enough of this," the man snarled. "Hand over the notebook, or I'll..." Before he could finish, a blur of golden fur leapt into view. Buddy slammed into the man with the pistol, knocking him off balance. The gun fired, the shot ringing out and echoing through the trees. But the bullet struck harmlessly into the ground. Jake seized the moment, slamming the butt of his shotgun into the third man's stomach. The attacker doubled over, gasping for air as Jake wrestled him to the ground. Buddy, unrelenting, barked furiously, chasing the man with the pistol as he scrambled to his feet and fled into the woods. "You'll regret this," the leader shouted, clutching his side as he staggered backward. "This isn't over." Jake didn't reply. He watched as the men retreated into the shadows, their curses fading into the night. The clearing grew still again, the sound of Buddy's heavy panting breaking the silence. Jake lowered his shotgun, his chest heaving as the adrenaline coursed through his veins. "Good boy," Jake murmured, crouching to place a hand on Buddy's head. The dog wagged his tail weakly, his body trembling from exertion. Jake stood and hurried into the cabin, where Misty greeted him with a mix of excitement and relief. She jumped onto his leg, her small frame quivering as she barked softly. "It's all right," Jake said, scooping her up. "We're okay." But even as he said the words, he knew the danger wasn't over. The men would regroup, and next time, they wouldn't come unprepared. Jake spent the next few hours reinforcing the cabin. He barricaded the windows and secured the doors, his mind racing with plans. He couldn't stay here forever. The notebook needed to reach the sheriff. But getting to town without being intercepted was a daunting task. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Jake sat at the table, his fingers tracing the worn cover of the notebook. Buddy and Misty lay nearby, their bodies pressed together for warmth. Jake's gaze drifted to the dogs. "You two didn't ask for any of this," he said quietly. "But we're in it now, together." Buddy's tail thumped softly against the floor, and Misty let out a small sigh, her eyes closing as she rested her head on Buddy's side. By the time dawn broke, Jake had a plan. He packed only the essentials, the notebook, some food, and a few supplies. He slung the shotgun over his shoulder and knelt beside the dogs. "We're heading out," he said, "straight to the sheriff's office. No more detours." Buddy stood immediately, his posture alert. Misty, though smaller and less sturdy, wagged her tail and nuzzled Jake's hand as if to say, "We're ready." Jake opened the cabin door, his breath fogging in the icy air. The path ahead was uncertain, but his resolve was unwavering. As they stepped into the snow, Jake glanced back at the cabin, his home for so many years, now a symbol of the life he had to leave behind. "This isn't just about us anymore," he said, his voice steady. "We're going to end this." With Buddy leading the way and Misty by his side, Jake set off toward Timber Creek, the weight of the notebook in his pack a reminder of the battle still ahead. The snow-covered forest stretched endlessly before them, every step forward crunching softly underfoot. Jake moved carefully, his senses sharp. The sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows through the dense pines. Buddy led the way, his nose close to the ground, while Misty trotted beside Jake, her smaller frame occasionally sinking into the deeper snow. The weight of the notebook in Jake's pack felt heavier with each passing mile. The knowledge it contained wasn't just dangerous, it was damning. He glanced down at Misty, who looked up at him with trustful amber eyes, her tail wagging faintly. "We're getting there," Jake muttered, as much to himself as to the dogs. As they approached a narrow ravine, Buddy suddenly stopped, his body tensing. He let out a low growl, his ears perked forward. Jake froze, gripping the shotgun slung across his back. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Buddy took a cautious step forward, his growl deepening. Jake followed his gaze and spotted movement on the ridge above them. 3 figures, their silhouettes stark against the bright snow. "They've found us," Jake muttered under his breath. The men moved quickly, their shouts echoing through the ravine. Jake scanned the area, his mind racing. The narrow path offered no cover, and doubling back would only delay the inevitable. He crouched down, pulling Misty close. "Stay with me," he murmured. Then, turning to Buddy, he said firmly, "You know what to do." Buddy let out a sharp bark, his body coiling with anticipation. The first shot rang out, splintering a branch above Jake's head. He flinched, pulling Misty lower into the snow. The men were closing in, their heavy boots crunching against the frozen ground. Jake raised his shotgun, firing a warning shot into the air. The loud crack reverberated through the ravine, causing the men to pause briefly. "You don't want to do this," Jake shouted, his voice echoing. "Turn around and walk away," one of the men, undeterred, shouted back. "Just give us the notebook, Harrison. No one has to get hurt." Jake's jaw tightened. "You'll have to come and take it." The next few moments were a blur of chaos. The men descended into the ravine, their weapons raised. Jake fired again, this time aiming low, forcing them to scatter. Buddy sprang into action, darting through the snow with startling speed. He charged one of the men, knocking him off balance and sending his rifle skidding across the ice. The man shouted in surprise, struggling to fend off the dog's relentless attack. Jake seized the opportunity, taking aim at another assailant. The second man hesitated, clearly unnerved by Buddy's ferocity. Before he could recover, Jake advanced, swinging the butt of his shotgun into the man's side and sending him sprawling into the snow. "Stay down," Jake barked, his voice filled with authority. Amid the chaos, the leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, advanced toward Jake with calculated precision. He held a pistol steady, his cold eyes locked on the notebook peeking from Jake's pack. "You've made this harder than it needed to be," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "Hand it over, or your dogs pay the price." Jake's grip on the shotgun tightened. "You're not getting this notebook," he said through gritted teeth. The man smirked, raising the pistol, but before he could fire, Misty let out a high-pitched bark and darted forward. The man flinched, momentarily thrown off by the small dog's sudden movement. Jake didn't waste the moment. He surged forward, knocking the pistol from the man's hand and tackling him to the ground. The 2 men grappled in the snow, their breaths visible in the freezing air. Buddy, sensing Jake's struggle, abandoned his first target and charged toward the leader. The dog's sheer strength overwhelmed the man, forcing him onto his back. Jake scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving. He grabbed the pistol from the snow and pointed it at the man, who raised his hands in surrender. "Call off your men," Jake growled. The man hesitated, his eyes flicking to Buddy, who stood over him, teeth bared. "Now," Jake barked. Reluctantly, the man signaled to the others, who were already battered and retreating. One by one, They backed away, disappearing into the trees. When the clearing fell silent, Jake lowered the pistol, his hands trembling. Buddy stepped back from the man on the ground, his growl subsiding. Misty, despite her smaller size, stood beside Jake, her tail wagging furiously as if celebrating their victory. Jake glared down at the leader. "If I see you again, I won't be this generous." The man scrambled to his feet, clutching his side as he staggered into the forest. As the forest grew still once more, Jake sank to his knees, exhaustion washing over him. Buddy padded over, nuzzling his shoulder, while Misty curled up beside him. "We're not far now," Jake said softly, looking at the dogs. "Just a little farther." He stood, his resolve stronger than ever. Together, the three of them pressed on, the lights of Timber Creek faintly visible in the distance, a beacon of hope at the end of a perilous journey. The sun was dipping low in the sky as Jake, Buddy, and Misty finally reached the outskirts of Timber Creek. The small mountain town was quiet, the streets dusted with a thin layer of snow. A few chimneys puffed trails of smoke into the crisp air, but most windows were darkened, their occupants settled in for the night. Jake pulled his hood tighter against the cold, his breath fogging in front of him. He glanced down at Misty, who was sticking close to his side, her tail wagging faintly. Buddy walked ahead, his posture alert as if he knew their journey wasn't quite over. The sheriff's office came into view, a squat, brick building with a single flickering street lamp illuminating the steps. Jake paused, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't nervous about facing Sheriff Bradley, but he knew this moment would set everything in motion. Jake pushed open the heavy door, the bell above jingling softly. The warmth inside was immediate, a stark contrast to the icy streets. Behind the desk sat Sheriff Bradley, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with a grizzled beard and a piercing gaze. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Jake," Bradley said, standing. "Didn't think I'd see you here after all these years." Jake nodded curtly, his hand tightening around the strap of his pack. "Wish it were under better circumstances." Bradley's eyes shifted to the dogs. Buddy stood tall, his intelligent gaze scanning the room, while Misty peeked out from behind Jake's leg, her nose twitching. "Those the strays you mentioned?" Bradley asked. "They're more than that," Jake replied. He pulled the notebook from his pack and set it on the desk. "This is what I called about." Bradley opened the notebook, his expression darkening as he flipped through the pages. Each entry seemed to harden his features further until he finally snapped the book shut. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. Jake explained everything: the abandoned mill, the cages, the attack at his cabin, and the men in the ravine. Bradley listened intently, his jaw tightening with each detail. "This is worse than I thought," Bradley muttered. He turned to the deputy seated nearby, a young woman named Riley. "Get a team together. We need to check out that mill ASAP." Riley nodded, grabbing her coat and heading out the door, while the sheriff made plans. Jake sat with the dogs in the corner of the room. Misty had curled up on a blanket provided by Riley, while Buddy sat vigilantly at Jake's feet, his sharp eyes fixed on the front door. "You really stepped into something big," Bradley said, joining Jake at the table. "Didn't have much of a choice," Jake replied. He glanced at the notebook, then at the dogs. "Someone had to do something," Bradley sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You always had that in you, Jake. Even after what happened, you never stopped caring." Jake stiffened at the mention of his past. "This isn't about me," he said firmly. "It's about stopping those bastards before they hurt anyone or anything else." Bradley nodded, his expression softening. "And we will." The hours dragged on as the sheriff's team prepared to raid the mill. Jake insisted on staying at the station until the operation was complete. He couldn't leave until he knew the men responsible for the cruelty were stopped. As night fell, the station buzzed with activity. Officers came and went, gathering supplies and finalizing plans. Jake watched quietly, his hand resting on Buddy's head. "You two saved me back there," Jake said softly, glancing at the dogs. "Now it's my turn to return the favor." Buddy let out a low, reassuring bark, while Misty wagged her tail in agreement. Around midnight, the radio crackled to life. Riley's voice came through, tense but clear. "Sheriff, we've secured the mill, found the cages, just like Harrison said. No sign of Ward or his men, though." Bradley frowned, grabbing the radio. "Any evidence they've been back recently?" "Plenty," Riley replied. "Tracks in the snow, half-eaten food, even a fire pit still warm. They're not far." "All right," Bradley said. "Stay sharp and keep me updated." He turned to Jake, his expression grim. "Looks like your friends decided to run." Jake's jaw tightened. "They won't go far. They need the forest to cover their tracks." Bradley nodded. "And we'll find them." The next morning, the sheriff's team returned with several rescued animals: dogs, cats, and even a few exotic birds. Each one bore the marks of neglect, their matted fur and frightened eyes a testament to their suffering. Jake watched as the animals were unloaded, his chest tightening. Buddy and Misty stayed by his side, their gazes fixed on the others as if recognizing their shared pain. One of the deputies approached Jake, holding a timid beagle with a torn ear. "Found him in one of the cages," the deputy said. "Poor guy wouldn't stop shaking until we brought him out." Jake reached out, stroking the beagle's head gently. The dog leaned into his touch, his tail wagging faintly. "They'll be okay now," Jake said quietly, glancing at Buddy and Misty. "Just like you two." As the day wore on, news of the raid spread through Timber Creek. Locals stopped by the station to offer supplies, volunteer help, or simply thank Jake for what he'd done. For a man who had spent years in isolation, the outpouring of gratitude was overwhelming. Martha, the owner of the feed store, arrived with a bag of treats and a warm smile. "You've done something amazing here, Jake," she said, scratching Buddy behind the ears. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Jake nodded, his throat tight with emotion. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging, a purpose beyond his own grief. That evening, as the station quieted down, Bradley approached Jake. "We've got a lead on Ward," the sheriff said. "Looks like he's holed up in a cabin on the far side of the forest. It's isolated, but we'll get to him." Jake stood, his expression hardening. "I'm coming with you." Bradley raised an eyebrow. "Jake!" "No arguments," Jake interrupted. "This isn't just about the notebook anymore. I need to see this through." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded. "All right, let's finish this." The sun hung low in the sky as Jake, Sheriff Bradley, and a team of deputies made their way through the forest. Snow crunched underfoot, and the air was heavy with tension. Buddy and Misty stayed close to Jake, their presence both comforting and resolute. The lead deputy, Riley, held up a hand, signaling for the group to stop. She pointed ahead, where smoke curled faintly above the treetops. "That's the cabin," Riley whispered. Bradley nodded, his expression grim. "All right, everyone, stay sharp. We don't know how many of them are in there." Jake adjusted the shotgun slung over his shoulder, his gaze fixed on the distant cabin. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it, the final step in a journey that had begun with two battered dogs on his doorstep. The group moved carefully, spreading out to surround the cabin. Jake stayed close to Bradley, with Buddy and Misty following quietly. As they approached, Jake could make out the faint hum of voices coming from inside. "They're in there," Bradley muttered. "At least two, maybe three." Jake nodded, his jaw tight. Bradley motioned to the deputies, who fanned out to cover the exits. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped forward and banged on the door. "Ethan Ward," Bradley shouted, his voice ringing out through the trees. "This is the sheriff's department. Come out with your hands up." For a moment, there was silence. Then the door creaked open, and Ethan Ward stepped into the doorway, His scarred face twisted into a sneer as he surveyed the group. Well, Ward drawled. The good sheriff and his little posse. And here I thought you'd be smarter than this. Bradley, don't test me. Ward. Bradley warned. It's over. Surrender now, and we'll make this easy. Ward's sneer deepened. Easy? You think this ends with me putting my hands up? You've got no idea what you're up against. Before anyone could react, Ward stepped back inside, slamming the door shut. Shots rang out a moment later, bullets tearing through the wooden frame. Get down, Bradley barked, pulling Jake behind a tree for cover. The deputies returned fire, their shots aimed at the windows and door. Buddy barked furiously, his body tense as he crouched beside Jake. This guy's not going quietly, Jake muttered, his grip tightening on his shotgun. Bradley nodded grimly. We've got him pinned. Riley, take 2 deputies and cover the back. Jake, you're with me. As Riley and her team moved around the cabin, Jake and Bradley crept closer to the front. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through him. He glanced at Buddy, who met his gaze with unwavering determination. I need you to stay close. Boy, Jake whispered. Buddy let out a soft bark, his tail wagging once. Bradley kicked open the door, his gun raised. Jake followed, his shotgun steady as they entered the dimly lit cabin. The stench of smoke and unwashed bodies was overwhelming. Inside, Ward stood at the far end of the room, his pistol trained on them. Beside him, another man held a knife to the throat of a young golden retriever, his body trembling in fear. Don't take another step, Ward growled, or the dog gets it. Jake's blood ran cold, the golden retriever's wide, frightened eyes reminded him of Buddy and Misty when he first found them. Ward, don't do this, Bradley said, his tone firm but calm. You've lost. Let the dog go, and we'll talk. Ward shook his head, his grip on the pistol tightening. You don't get it, do you? This isn't about winning or losing. This is survival. People like me don't get second chances. You had a choice, Jake said, stepping forward. His voice was steady, but his anger was barely contained. You could have walked away from this life, but instead, you chose cruelty. Ward's gaze flicked to Jake, his sneer returning. And you think you're better? Just another bleeding heart pretending to care. Jake took another step forward, his eyes locked on Ward. Maybe, but at least I'm trying. Before Ward could respond, Buddy sprang into action. The dog leapt at the man holding the golden retriever, his powerful jaws clamping onto the attacker's arm. The man screamed, dropping the knife as he tried to fend off Buddy. Jake didn't hesitate. He raised his shotgun, aiming at Ward's pistol. The shot rang out, knocking the weapon from Ward's hand. Bradley rushed forward, tackling Ward to the ground and cuffing him while Jake grabbed the trembling golden retriever, cradling it gently. It's okay, Jake murmured, stroking the dog's head. You're safe now. Outside, the deputies rounded up the remaining members of Ward's crew. The operation was over, the cabin secured. Jake stood in the clearing, Buddy and Misty by his side. The rescued golden retriever nuzzled Jake's leg, his tail wagging timidly. Bradley approached, his expression weary but satisfied. We got them all, he said. This is over. Jake nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. For now, Bradley placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. You did good, Jake. Real good. Jake glanced at Buddy and Misty, a small smile tugging at his lips. We all did. The days following the raid passed in a blur. Timber Creek, once shrouded in quiet isolation, was now buzzing with activity. News of the sheriff's operation spread quickly, drawing the attention of local media and animal rescue organizations. Jake, Buddy, and Misty found themselves at the center of it all, hailed as heroes by the townsfolk. For Jake, the attention was overwhelming. He had spent years hiding from the world, burdened by his grief and guilt. Now, for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose, a reason to face each day. One morning, As the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring touched the forest, Jake sat on the porch of his cabin with Buddy and Misty at his feet. The golden retriever they had rescued during the raid, now named Sunny, played nearby, her joyful barks echoing through the trees. Martha, the feed store owner, arrived with a basket of treats and supplies. She set it down beside Jake, smiling warmly. "You've got the whole town talking," she said. Jake chuckled softly, scratching behind Buddy's ears. "Not sure I deserve all that." Martha shook her head. "You didn't just save those animals, Jake. You reminded people that it's never too late to do the right thing." Jake glanced at Buddy and Misty, their wagging tails a testament to the bond they shared. "They're the real heroes," he said. Martha leaned down to pet Misty, who nuzzled her hand affectionately. "Maybe, but they couldn't have done it without you." Over the next few weeks, Jake worked closely with Sheriff Bradley and local volunteers to ensure the rescued animals found loving homes. Buddy and Misty often accompanied him to the shelter, where their presence seemed to calm even the most frightened animals. Jake also began to reconnect with the community he had once withdrawn from. He joined efforts to improve Timber Creek's animal welfare programs, using his experience to educate others about the dangers of animal trafficking. Through it all, Buddy and Misty remained by his side, their loyalty unwavering. One crisp afternoon, Jake found himself back at the abandoned mill. The site was quiet now, its dark history replaced by the promise of renewal. Volunteers had begun repurposing the building into a rescue center, a safe haven for animals in need. As Jake walked through the cleared-out space, Buddy and Misty trotted beside him, their noses twitching as they explored. Sunny followed close behind, her golden coat gleaming in the sunlight streaming through the broken windows. "This is where it all started," Jake said softly, kneeling to scratch Buddy behind the ears. "But it's not where it ends." On the anniversary of the raid, the town organized a small ceremony to honor those who had made a difference. Jake stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, trying to avoid the spotlight, but when Sheriff Bradley called his name, the townsfolk erupted in cheers. Jake hesitated before stepping forward, Buddy and Misty flanking him. Sunny darted ahead, earning a few laughs as she wagged her tail enthusiastically. Bradley handed Jake a plaque, his voice steady as he said, "For courage, resilience, and reminding us all that even in the darkest times, we can make a difference." Jake accepted the plaque, his throat tight with emotion. He looked out at the crowd, then down at the dogs by his side. "I didn't do this alone," he said, his voice rough but sincere. "Buddy and Misty, they're the reason I'm standing here today. They reminded me that no matter how far you've fallen, you can always find a way back." That evening, Jake returned to his cabin. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, and the dogs lay sprawled contentedly on the rug. Jake sat in his favorite chair, the plaque resting on the table beside him. As he sipped his coffee, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The grief and guilt that had once consumed him felt lighter now, replaced by a sense of peace he hadn't thought possible. Buddy stretched lazily, his deep brown eyes meeting Jake's. Misty let out a soft sigh, curling up closer to Sunny. Jake smiled, reaching down to pat their heads. "You two saved me as much as I saved you," he said quietly. "Maybe even more." The forest outside was still, the first stars twinkling in the clear night sky. For the first time in years, Jake felt at home, not just in the cabin, but in his own skin. And as the dogs drifted into a peaceful sleep, Jake allowed himself to do the same, his heart full of gratitude and hope for the days to come.